Welcome to our afternoon breakout session on small cells and pole attachments, which I'm encouraged by the attendance. I see lots of people here that want to talk small cells and pole attachments. It's a topic that I find very interesting. So it's always reassuring to feel you're not the only one, you know, when it comes to this very nerdy stuff that we do. There's strength in numbers, but I digress. First of all, thank you again, everyone, for taking time out of your day to participate in these crucial conversations about connecting communities. I have with me a panel of 4 experts on these topics that represent a variety of perspectives, and they don't always agree, which is a good thing. We're blessed to have these brilliant individuals with us. We're also blessed by the fact we have a little bit more time in the schedule than we initially planned for. So I think that lends itself very well to audience participation. So we'll be leaving a healthy block of time at the end of the hour for audience question and answer. So we hope that people jump right in. I've already entertained several questions at last night's reception and today in the breaks between panels. So I know there's a lot of interest in this topic, and I look forward to hearing from our experts, who are starting at my immediate right, Courtney Schmidt from SureSite, and we've got Casey Lide from Baller Stokes Lide, Dave Young from the city of Lincoln, Nebraska, and Michael Calabrese from the Open Technology Institute at New America in Washington, D.C. So, beginning with this fun topic of small cells and pole attachments. First question all the way to the end at Michael Calabrese. We are often told that small cells can be a bit of a misnomer, that they come in all shapes and sizes. Can you share a little small cells 101 with the audience for those of us that aren't as well versed in this or as deeply as some of the folks on the panel?
Okay, I'll give it a try. The whole concept of small cells is really represents a shift among, and you'll hear it mainly among, cellular providers, mobile carriers, a shift from an emphasis on coverage and building penetration to capacity. So until, for years and until fairly recently, the primary applications for mobile service, right, were voice calling, that was 2G, and then internet access, became possible. Remember Edge, 3G, but now we're up to 4G. So voice texting, even basic web surfing is very limited bandwidth. So the premium for carriers was to cover the biggest areas with less infrastructure. So you had the big cell towers covering a big area because the capacity within that big cell could be shared among many users since their bandwidth demands were not very high. But of course, as smartphone penetration has skyrocketed and we're all now streaming HD video, all of a sudden the bandwidth demands are very challenging, but the amount of spectrum stays pretty much the same for the carriers. There's been very little new spectrum put out there. So they're essentially just dividing cells. I mean, they've been dividing cells obviously for years, but it's gotten to the point now where they need to literally go to small cells where you may just have, in high traffic areas, every 300 feet or so have an access point. So that densification of networks is not about coverage anymore, it's about capacity. And it also means one implication of that is they can use, it used to be that the best spectrum to get was the lower band spectrum, the low frequency spectrum that could penetrate buildings. And in fact, one reason that Verizon and AT&T have had such an advantage in quality of service is they received an initial free grant of TV spectrum, and they control over 80% of the TV spectrum that's been repurposed to wireless. And so they have great in-building penetration, whereas T-Mobile and Sprint generally does not. But now as you move to capacity, you're talking about wide channels that can and potentially gigabit capacity in a cell. And so suddenly the mid-band and the high-band frequencies are most important. And one other point I'd make, I think, so that you can kind of, grasp it even more readily for those who are new to this, is the leading example of small cells is Wi-Fi. That's what Wi-Fi always was, and that's why Wi-Fi, somebody, it might have been Jory or somebody mentioned earlier, that Wi-Fi is currently transporting 70 to 80% of all mobile device data traffic today. And that's because the carrier networks, which are still based on larger cells and limited spectrum, can't carry all that capacity. But Wi-Fi is almost required to be small cell because it's very low power. It's the public park where you have to operate only at low power. And so spectrum is reused over and over again. And it began with relatively high bandwidth for the needs at that time. And now even Wi-Fi is moving up to higher frequencies and much wider channels, in step with cellular. Cellular talks about 5G, but high bandwidth Wi-Fi will be a form of 5G that will be right there alongside it.
So, Courtney, that begs the question. We just a moment ago at our lunch keynote, we heard the comparison between macro tower siting and small cell siting. And there's a different process there, and there have been some policy changes here in Arizona to accommodate some of the changed realities. But are small cells replacing macro cells? Do small cells mean that we're done with macro cells, or what's on the horizon?
Yep. No, small cells do not necessarily replace a macro cell. I would say probably 15 to 20 years ago when we started building out the macro network, the discussion was, satellites one day will replace the macro sites. And we continued to build out macro sites, whether they're on towers that we're all typically used to, rooftops in certain areas, urban areas. Those rooftops are much shorter than other more urban areas or rural areas. But the one thing that small cell does is small cell enables the wireless carrier to get closer to the user and also enables them to prep the infrastructure that's needed for 5G. As it was mentioned earlier, 5G and small cell networks are the preparation for the immense amount of data that is going through these networks on a daily basis, and it's only going to increase. And the amount of data that will actually be running through these wireless networks will at some point in time exceed that which goes through the Wi-Fi networks. Yes, in fact, they do work together, and if you're with certain carriers, there's more of a functionality to that you perhaps don't even recognize when your phone's moving from cellular to Wi-Fi. But the importance of these small cell networks, whether they're in the right-of-way or on private property, is that it's a preparation of what's next for our communities, be it IoT, smart cities, and an expansion of the wireless functionality across the country.
Next Century Cities members like Lincoln, Nebraska have been doing some really interesting work on small cells. David, can you share with us a little bit just what's the Lincoln story for those that may not be aware?
Thank you. Lincoln, Nebraska, 250,000-ish people, state capital, university town. Our number one problem in the last 5 years is attracting and retaining young people in our town. We have a very low 2.5%, 2.7% unemployment rate. So we started looking at our broadband infrastructure as a way to do that, to create a competitive advantage. As many of you know, smaller communities are competing with larger communities in the United States and in the world now in some cases for employees and businesses. So what was Lincoln, Nebraska's competitive advantage going to be? The amount of corn we have? No. So we started with fiber to the business, ensuring every business in our town had access to competitive broadband, fiber-based, affordable. We started that in 2012, and by 2015, we were doing fiber to the home. We have a public-private partnership. Nebraska is one of those states that bans municipal fiber for retail purposes, dark fiber, lit fiber. We are not allowed to do that. We have an institutional network that we run for public buildings, and then we have created this public-private partnership model. Small cells really represent the third leg of the broadband strategy for our community. We want, as a business, for you to have affordable, high-quality internet. We want, as a citizen, for you to have it at your home, 1 gig or better, affordable. And we want in your phone, in your hand, anywhere in our community, for you to have this service. To that end, we have a model where any carrier can come in and say, I would like to replace this streetlight pole. We have a standard that they've agreed to in a contract, and we have 118 sites that will be built this year, which represent about $7 million of infrastructure investment in our community. The city will receive about $400,000 in fees from that. So it represents a lot of money.
So I think that you've done a great job of saying we've heard why this is of interest and matters to providers as well as why it matters to cities. But Dave, before you put the mic down, can I ask you to spell out a little bit about what agreements you came to, what were some of the terms, the give and take on the siting and the approval process?
At its core, we will argue that broadband infrastructure is a public asset. So however you get there, whether it's privately developed and owned privately, but it's located in the public right-of-way, it's a service. And we want to make sure everybody has it. So with that as our core principle, we went into small cells with the mindset that the city owns 25,000 potential small cell locations, streetlights. How can we leverage that and partner it? What does your partner want? They want a really fast turn time on their permit. They come in and they say, I want that site. They want a quick response, yes or no. We retain the right as a community to say, no, this is a special area. We do not want a small cell in there. A historic district, entertainment district, our capital environs community. We want you to go through a special process. Great. With that said, that probably represents 10% of our polls. So we created a standard in partnership with Valmont, who's the big pole manufacturer. There's a couple of them, but Valmont's in Nebraska. And said this pole will be for about 90% of our polls. If you walk in, it's not in a special district, and you say you're going to replace that pole with this standard small cell pole, we will say yes, and we will say yes in 2 days. And that's why we want you to come and do business in Nebraska, and why we want you to do business in Lincoln. For that, we charge $1,500 for that permit. We also charge $2,000 a year for the right to attach. But our competitive advantage is we will give you a yes or a no very quickly.
Operating at the speed of business, as they like to say. Casey, we haven't heard from you yet. How does this all strike you? How can cities be partnership ready? Is the Lincoln model a good model? You work with a lot of cities. You work with cities from all over the country. What are you hearing from them? Take it away.
Well, one of the challenges as to whether Lincoln's a good model or not is that there's no, we hear it on all sorts of contexts. There's no one-size-fits-all approach here, and based on variances in state law and local law, it's certainly true in this context as well. As for what is partnership ready, I think it's a spectrum, really. On the one end, how ready is a locality to respond quickly, as they do in Nebraska when somebody comes and wants to cite something? Is a locality ready to process it quickly and approach the issue from a regulatory perspective and manage their right-of-way reasonably while allowing the service provider to to get their equipment in place and begin offering services, which most localities actually want to have happen in our experience. Going down the spectrum from that, there are, it seems to me, a number of different options in the public-private partnership realm, where you can have, if the municipality owns fiber or has poles that they want to see replaced, maybe there's an opportunity for a revenue share. There might be some capital financing that can be assisted with the municipality. There's a whole, I think, a wide open field for partnerships in this that is really not, we haven't seen it all yet, or much of it yet. And so, at the first stage, I think, is municipalities being able to act effectively, and that means making some institutional decisions, some changes. You have situations where a local Department of Transportation is called upon to review permit applications for small cells. That's something they're probably not used to doing in the past. And this collision between, it may be something that the zoning department did, but now you're talking about public rights of way. And depending on the locality, the zoning code may not even extend to the right of way. It may go to the center of the street, it may go to the boundary of the street. And, it depends on the location. So, being ready to respond quickly and effectively is one side, but I think there's a lot of upside opportunity as well.
Yeah, one thing that well, by the way, I do want to say, if anyone has any response to any of this, go right ahead, Mike.
Well, it's actually not a direct response, but I just realized as we were talking, a couple of things were mentioned that I should have, one thing I should have mentioned about small cells, just so it's good to keep in mind as we're talking about this, is Courtney mentioned how, a small cell allows the operator, whoever, to bring the access point close to the user. That's important because it's not just the promise of 5G and the Internet of Things connectivity is not just big bandwidth, but also low latency. In other words, that now there's delay in mobile networks because you get processed through the tower and so on. But by bringing that access point with a lot of bandwidth really close, the thinking is that the latency will get down to 1 or 2 milliseconds, which will enable a lot of real-time applications, including public safety, auto safety applications like that. The other thing to keep in mind, as I was reminded by David, is that you also have to consider too that what you're really talking about is that small cells are in a high fiber diet, right? In other words, everywhere where you have small cells, you have to have fiber, because all they really are is just wireless extensions of the wireless, increasingly short wireless extension of the wireline network. That's why I used compared it to Wi-Fi, which is what Wi-Fi is in your home. Think of it that way. So you really you have to be thinking it's not just, it's just another G like 4G to 5G. It's literally all about having, fiber all through everywhere that you think you're going to have this high throughput wireless connectivity.
Yeah, and one thing that I'll put on a plug. Last fall, Next Century Cities published a blog about small cells that said small cells mean more fiber, not less, to try and break down for our members some of these questions. Courtney, from the industry perspective, from someone that works in whose stock and trade is small cells, we often hear there's a little bit of a tension, right? So we hear from Next Century Cities members, look, we are so ready to partner. We want to get this done. And I think, Casey, you probably, as you alluded to, cities all across America, your clients say, we want to find a way to get this done, but there's a lot of local, necessarily unique issues. That leads many on the industry side to say, look, we need to get this stuff out there. We need to meet demand, the demand that's only increasing. So therefore, we need a state-level preemption law. And we're here in Arizona where the League of Cities and some of the providers were able to negotiate something that they all were more, okay with if they didn't love. Where does SureSite find itself in this Can we work on a case-by-case basis with cities respecting their individuality, or do we need a state-level policy?
I would say it's a blend. The important part about the deployment of small cell networks, especially in the right-of-way, and similar to Lincoln's experience, is having those discussions early on, coming to the jurisdiction, presenting the plan, discussing design options, discussing the longevity of the build. It may be, 2 or 3 this year. It may be 2 or 3 next year. It may be, multiple ones the following year. Keeping in mind that there's opportunity around a robust network that should and has the opportunity to outweigh any long-term revenue that would potentially come as a result of that antenna being attached to a city-owned piece of infrastructure. Certainly there's opportunity there. The balance between that and working with its jurisdiction compared to what a potential carrier who might be a public utility has an opportunity to go around that process. Balancing those is huge in the beginning to make sure that there's an opportunity for some negotiation on design, some negotiation on placement, on timing of permits, but also making sure that it works from a long-term perspective for that carrier to make sure that they have an interest in ensuring that there is a robust network for the future for your community, as opposed to having them go down the road and develop the network somewhere else first and then come back later once potentially state law has been enacted, or there's some other need that forces them to come back into the community after the fact.
All right, so Casey, coming back to you. Local issues, local legal developments that cities need to be aware of, and how does and to what extent, if at all, does the actual equipment affect the underlying legal issues? Because we'll often hear deployers say, oh, a small cell, that's just the size of a pizza box. I don't know what all the big fuss is about when it comes to deciding them. But then we'll also hear cities say, they tried to put, they tried to put a Volkswagen Beetle up on one of our poles, and so obviously there is a little bit of variation there in terms of what the policy response should be. So can you take?
Right, I think there's quite a lot of variation. Some people say small cells are small only when compared to your giant tower outside of town, right? And there's something to that. At the most essential level, it's a physical issue of loading on a pole. Sometimes you will see presentations from carriers and they will show a little whip antenna poking out of the top of a pole and say, that's all we're going to do. Other times, you might have a little bit of a more realistic picture of something that is coming off of a pole and is a little bit larger, and you may only be able to have one of those on a pole at a time, and then you violate your loading issues. So those physical implications are one aspect of it. From the legal perspective, you have all sorts of I like to think of it in two sets of a framework with two sides on the legal side. There's a side of access to the rights of way, and then there's the attachment to the city-owned property side. And each of those sides are treated rather differently under local law often and under federal law definitely. And you really, it seems, have to go into it with that framework in mind when you're talking to the providers about what they want to do. And the other thing I would add, and it'd be, we would wish the providers would all do what Courtney is describing, and but it seems that at least in the early days, meaning now, I suppose, a number of, or at least some providers have come in with a little bit less of a collaborative mindset, and they come and they say, hey, we have a certificate from the state, we're a certificated provider, that means we have the right to put our stuff anywhere, and you can't stop us. And that may not necessarily be the case. And it's very important for the local government to be on their toes on this and to verify whether the provider is in fact certificated, if they are certificated, whether they have the rights that they claim to have, And if those rights are subject to, which they usually are, the right of the locality to manage the public rights of way, which then gives them, the locality, the opportunity to make decisions about siting and size and all the other things that are within the purview of right-of-way management.
I think your comment really hit on something that is key and an often missed point in this conversation. Those of us that care about competition, we're a little bit at cross purposes, because if you think that 4 major national carriers has been a boon to the public interest because it has stimulated investment and innovation in feature sets and driven down costs, you want to see 4 viable carriers. They need small cells, they say. At the same time, because of the load issues, it's entirely possible that, you know, the first one to get the pole on there is the only one that gets the pole on there. First one to get the small cell on the pole is the only one that's going to have a small cell on that pole. So if you think about small cells as a vehicle to sustained competition that should be benefiting all of us, you actually may find yourself in a sort of at cross purposes with your own policy goals if the first person to deploy is deploying something so large that it precludes other deployers.
Or so not just so large, but taking up so many poles. I mean, there's a land rush going on right now, and you could call it squatting in some places. It may go too far, but keep in mind that local governments, when it comes to the right-of-way side of things, are operating under federal laws that require them to act in a non-discriminatory fashion. So if somebody comes along and wants to put a facility on every 4th pole or one every 200 meters, and somebody else comes along and they say, we want to do the same thing, somebody else comes along, pretty soon you have small cells on every single pole. And sure, that may be good for competition, or that maybe that's the only way you can encourage competition, but that goes against considerations like aesthetics and just having your city look like something out of Blade Runner.
So, David, how do we make sure that cities not end up in a Blade Runner scenario?
We will end up in a Blade Runner scenario. Let's just put, what we did in Lincoln was we designed the pole up front. We made the equipment mounting agnostic, but we include concealment elements in the pole and not to exceed size and volume requirements. For us, there are optimum locations for a carrier to come in and put a pole. They would like this one spot. It's the prime spot. Across the street, almost at the same interval, is B, the alternate spot. You can go down the block and get spot C, and they will. It's not the best spot for their radio frequency, but they'll still get the coverage that they're looking for, or 98% of it. But yes, you will end up with 4 small cells at every one of those locations. The way that you can go around that, if you will, is to deploy an ODAS system, but that is very expensive. And nobody wants to put in the money right now for the head-end, $10 million for a head-end equipment, and then you can deploy agnostic equipment all over the city. There are a few places that are doing that, very high-density cities, and that is available. I think there are some private companies out there who are looking to deploy that in a partnership model. The question is are you standing between the customer and what they want? It's better service. And as a city, are you there to dictate to the carrier, hey, I want an ODAS solution. I want you to spend $10 million on a head end before you can deploy anything. And if that's your stand as a community, you better be ready for them to go to the state level and fight you on that.
Courtney, I saw you nodding your head. Do you have something to...
Well, I would say the one thing that we have seen over the course of, let's say, the last 15 years, ODAS was something that was fairly popular 10, 15 years ago. You still saw it 5 years ago in unique situations, as you mentioned right now. But think about the convergence of cable and wireless operators coming together. We just finished an auction for 600. T-Mobile was the big winner. Comcast was right behind them, and then Dish. So when you look and you see the convergence of the content with the pipe or the network, right? You're going to see the need to efficiently and effectively deploy these networks. And the networks aren't just for us to talk on our phones. They're not just for us to text. They're for us to stream video. They're for us to gain access to the internet through just our our smartphone. I was just talking to some folks before this in regards to an article I read this morning, a millennial who was writing for a wireless magazine, and she's graduating from college and going off and traveling for a while, and her comment was, hey, when I get back, can you make sure that I can get my content and my data all on one bill? And that's ultimately what we're moving towards. And if you look at what we pay for our cable at home versus what we pay for our wireless service, the combination of those and how much it costs these wireless providers to actually deploy their networks, that's where you're seeing this model, this small cell model, be potentially the most efficient and most effective way right now to deploy a network that will meet the demands to actually deliver the content that we're all looking for in this room, and those that are younger than us and those that are older. But it definitely, the way we interact and the way these networks are used in the future, we're not contemplating at this point in time, but the carriers are thinking about it from a deployment perspective.
So one other, sort of shifting gears a little bit, we heard about some of there's streaming, there's content. Another real world application about this, we heard someone just earlier today on our main stage say, 5 years from now, we're going to be living in a world of autonomous vehicles. But I think the autonomous vehicles only work if you have not 99% uptime and connectivity, but 100% uptime and connectivity. And you can't have an autonomous driverless car that, when it rolls into a parking garage, loses its connectivity, because then what happens, right? It can't have even a moment when it's not connected, because then how would it respond to, say, a hazard in the road, or what would happen, right? So you get into a very scary situation fast if you have autonomous vehicles with even a momentary lapse in connectivity. So I think we then find ourselves in some public safety conversations where, a local government might say, you know what, I don't like the idea of a Blade Runner city, but maybe it's a trade-off I'll make. Michael, I see you smiling. Do you have any thoughts on where we might be in terms of application-wise, or whether you mentioned IoT or Internet of Things? Do you have any thoughts on what small cells portend, or what we'll need to do to get to that? There's that technological future that is allegedly 5 years away and has been for some time, but then again, I hear that it might be different this time.
So applications for small cells, right?
Sure.
Well, it's a really good question. I mean, I think one thing is I'm kind of much more in the camp of, 5G so far is mostly hype. That there's really, I think what you'll be seeing will be marketed as 5G for the next few years is just really 4G infill. In other words, trying to get, in high traffic areas, trying to get just more capacity for everything you're doing with 4G. 5G, as Todd kind of suggested, the way it's imagined is that it will have to be, fairly ubiquitous with very extremely low latency, and so far, I think the carriers, it's interesting. They're trying to, on the one hand, trying to get out ahead of it, the land rush. On the other hand, they're trying to figure out what's the business model, where's the extra revenue going to come from, who's going to pay for this, what do people really want? So even just on the issue of cars, there's a debate about, cars are already becoming connected with cellular, but at the same time, we just filed comments last week, in fact, with the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. They have pending a mandate for a proprietary wireless signaling system between cars, vehicle-to-vehicle safety signaling, which the auto industry imagines adding on to do all kinds of commercial applications like, in-car display advertising, and a lot of things that you can already get on your smartphone. So it's not even clear how directly 5G will relate to automobiles. It clearly would relate to a lot of things, and I think probably the most likely is the so-called Internet of Things, just tying a lot of things together with sensing, with monitors, and that's where a lot of low latency will really come in handy. I think the whole concept of the smart city is, is a real opportunity, but it won't necessarily have to be from cellular, because you will also have right along with it equally high bandwidth from open spectrum applications such as Wi-Fi and others that are coming along that are related to that, and I could say more about later.
Sure. I think I've got more questions prepared, but I think it's worth checking in with our audience. Do we have any questions from our audience? Hearing none? There was? I didn't see that.
Asking for clarification. I hear about large cells, I hear about small cells, I hear about picocells.
Okay, question is, what are picocells? Who wants to answer that?
Microcells, femtocells, there's several. Basically, all of those relate to the power of the radio. How much wattage are they putting out? And that's it. So all of them are a form of small cells. So that's why you get into this question of, is small cells really small? If they're putting a 40-watt radio on that street light, and they want battery backup in the right-of-way, and they want a generator in the right-of-way, and they want an MST sticking above ground to do all their splicing, some of the pictures you see, and the horror pictures, if you will, it looks like they parked a small bus in the right-of-way, and that's it for every location. And then you have complaints with people, the generator comes on at night, and they're not maintaining it. Excuse me. So that's the argument against small cells. The argument for is, if you do it right, it's a very sleek, nice-looking design, and people don't notice it.
It's also on Picos is the risk of seeming cynical. I would remind back though, say 5 or so years ago, the wireless industry was talking about, Picos were, I spoke at conferences where Picos were going to be the big thing. They were going to put Pico, each carrier was going to put its own Pico cells inside all of these buildings, including, all the public buildings. But they all wanted to put their own in there. And what happened is, it turned out this was very uneconomic, because Wi-Fi did the same thing that they wanted to do. Wi-Fi gave you offload. It was that extension cord to the underlying wireline network that had tons of capacity. And so you don't hear much about carriers putting Picos inside buildings anymore, because people just automatically default to Wi-Fi offload. And this is one of the things didn't want to go on too long, but was going to say before, is I think an exciting opportunity that's emerging. For example, the Federal Communications Commission 2 years ago adopted, and Todd and I both worked on advocating for this, a citizens broadband radio service, which is, there's tons of very good spectrum that's controlled by the federal government, but it's not used very much. So this band was 150 megahertz, 3.5 to 3.7 gigahertz, used by the Navy, but only offshore. So we said, well, why not open it for sharing as long as we can protect the Navy? So now what's really interesting is this is close to being available mostly on an open shared basis. And you have companies, I think particularly Ruckus, which has access points for inside venues that would give you capacity both for LTE and for Wi-Fi offload by combining the 150 megahertz for LTE with all the available Wi-Fi. And the idea of this is that it would be a neutral host network. You'd only need one indoor access point. It would handle anybody who comes in your building with a smartphone on any of the carriers could stay on their carrier network, or they could switch over to Wi-Fi. And the one access point does all that with plenty of capacity. And I think the carriers sort of hate that. But that's why I said you shouldn't assume that even outdoors that everything's going to be, mobile carrier small cells, because you could see a lot of these, neutral host access points coming to the fore as well.
Can I elaborate on that a little bit? Michael makes a great point that not everybody who approaches the city for rights in this area is going to be the same. They're not all going to be the commercial carriers like Verizon Wireless or AT&T. Crown Castle and American Tower, for example, are a bit different. Their revenue comes from the carriers. Their business is setting up a group of small cells or distributed antenna systems, or, and then connect them with fiber, get the siting rights from the municipality, and then have the contracts with the carriers who then use that equipment to propagate their signal and reach their mobile customers. And that's different from Verizon Wireless coming in and saying, I want a small cell to put up, and my revenue is going to come from my carrier, my mobile customers. So in a sense, Crown Castle, they have the ability to cut deals with multiple carriers. In theory, that's sort of a neutral host model. Every now and then I have a flight of fancy of some municipality trying to do some sort of open access neutral host project in this area, but I don't think anybody has done anything so crazy as of yet.
Well, we might have some. I see someone raising his hand. Maybe perhaps there's the crazy person we need, or just the lunatic we might be looking for. The question.
Question I have is, well, one of the comments to follow up on the CBRS stuff is the 365. It's a great idea, but I don't think yet, until we get to truly software-defined radios, that this talks. My iPhone talks 365. So I think that there's still some other work that needs to be done to get the edge device, the client device, to be making the benefits of 365. My question is this. How much, a few years ago I was hearing all about this Wi-Fi offload for the carriers. How much of that has really come into play today and is really taken hold?
All right, so for the benefit of those that might be live streaming and didn't hear the question, so has Wi-Fi offloading lived up to the hype? I think this is a good Michael Calabrese question, though anyone who'd like to answer, feel free to.
Yeah, others should jump in, but yeah, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, I'm trying to remember now if it was the CEO or the CTO, Verizon said, 80% of the mobile device traffic is offloading to Wi-Fi. And, the carrier networks, they could not possibly handle the traffic that we're generating now with video on smartphones and tablets. In fact, over 90% of tablets have no cellular connectivity anyway, so they're all completely on Wi-Fi. But smartphones, and surveys show that user surveys and actual measurements of device operation show that that Wi-Fi is still providing higher bandwidth, faster speeds than carrier networks do. And I personally think they get a great benefit from it. The carriers get a great benefit from it. They're very ambivalent about this because they're not monetizing that traffic directly. On the other hand, your overall consumer experience is much better. $100 may still be a lot to pay, but imagine if you'd probably have to pay $400 if you wanted all that traffic to run over their infrastructure and their spectrum, because that's 80% of what you're doing on your device that never touches a mobile carrier's equipment or spectrum that they buy at auction for billions and billions of dollars.
Sure. We have interest in a follow-up question. Yeah.
So with the Wi-Fi offload, I mean, is that happening transparently and seamlessly behind the scenes? Because what I had read a few years ago was that the carriers were going to have their own unique SSID environment and so forth. And so this cell phone that I have in my pocket, this smartphone, would be able to know that there was a T-Mobile or an AT&T compatible Wi-Fi network that they could seamlessly roam to without me having to do anything on my phone at all. Is that become a reality, or?
Mine does that now.
Okay.
Yeah, where it's available. Yeah, so AT&T's gone into Wi-Fi hotspots more than any of the other carriers, and they have a big network of hotspots that you're automatically authenticated to. And in fact, that's the whole basis of Comcast entering the mobile market, which they just announced, is they've turned all of their like 18 million wireline customers, both business and residential, into Wi-Fi hotspots, creating clouds in certain areas where they have dense subscribership. And so you're automatically authenticated to those any of those 18 million hotspots, plus another 600,000 or 700,000 cable consortium Wi-Fi hotspots outdoors in public areas. And they think they can create well, they've just launched a Wi-Fi first, product using Verizon as their backstop. But if they can push it up to 85 to 90% mobile offload, they'll actually be pretty profitable.
And Google's Project Fi does the same thing.
I think the one thing, and technically AT&T is the largest Wi-Fi network across the country. I think the one thing that you're going to see happen is that as more is done with the smartphone as opposed to the tablet, as opposed to being in your home, I think you're going to see more convergence of the cable and the cable operator and the carrier coming together. But I also think that that's where you're seeing that infrastructure come. That yes, there's the femto cells, there's the access points that we're all used to seeing on a daily basis, whether they're in our homes or in our office buildings. I think it's the mobile user on the go that's new. All of these other things have already really been in existence. It's the how do we deal with the mobile user.
This talk about the cable, by the way, prompts a legal question, and that I know some municipalities are facing with a cable operator who has a cable franchise who then wants to put up Wi-Fi equipment around, and they say, oh, it's part of the cable system. It may or may not be. That's a really unsettled question. It may depend on your franchise, but it's something to be aware of, and don't necessarily take them at their word that it is part of the cable system.
All right, so I see another question from the audience, and I have a policy question later that we may or may not get to, but let's hear from this gentleman.
So kind of a question about the aesthetics of small cell deployment and related to the high fiber diet aspect of small cells. There's a number of companies that for the better part of a decade now have been producing free space optical point-to-point small cell units, and my understanding is that they're not doing very well in this market. I was wondering if anybody could comment on the thoughts about free space optical small cells, what kind of market share they're going to have, and are they a viable way to possibly reduce the impact aesthetically in terms of digging up streets and things that these fiber access small cells have?
So you're talking about hybrid wireless fiber? Like the sort of thing that Starry and
No, I'm talking about
Siklu.
small cell units that connect with, for instance, there's a company called Lide that's been making one since 2011. So they are small cell radio units, but they also can communicate to each other with point-to-point free space optical, which is subject to fog and a number of other things. But at the level of a fiber trunk, they can connect using free space optical.
Response to that concept?
I would just mention that, it's interesting. Facebook has a pilot in San Jose, California called Terragraph, which is, but it's intended, the actual intent is the same thing that Google Fiber is working on, is to replace wireless for trenching. In other words, it's so expensive to trench that last 300 to 500 feet, that you replace it with fixed wireless. So this will be a fixed point-to-point. And in case of Terragraph, what they're deploying in San Jose, they say quite successfully, is adaptive mesh point-to-multi-point wireless. But what it's intended to do is, they say if you can bring a fiber pop into the neighborhood, then they just shoot it from there to several hundred megabits per second of connectivity to, let's say, 8 or 10 homes. But I haven't heard that there's been any deployments to use it as a as the backhaul for small cells per se, but I don't see why you couldn't do the same thing up and down streets and use fixed wireless as your backhaul rather than necessarily having a physical access point, so many physical access points. So it's interesting to think about.
We looked at it in Santa Monica years ago, because of the wind environment, we had to eliminate them because they got fog.
About
For those that didn't hear, Jory was saying that they evaluated a solution like this in Santa Monica in the past, but the foggy weather tended to interfere with their ability to propagate.
About 15 years ago, we did a test as well in Oklahoma to connect traffic signals instead of doing fiber between them, and it was a distance-limited technology, and that was the problem. And we have a lot of high wind, and so getting at the top of the pole to sway, that was the issue that we ran into there for getting that connectivity.
And the thing with the fog, just so everybody knows, that's because typically these systems are using millimeter wave spectrum, very high frequency spectrum that doesn't penetrate obstacles, which is actually where, you know, where carriers are moving for 5G, which is one reason they need to space these small cells, these access points so close together, because they don't have, they can only go so far, basically, with any integrity.
We have a little bit of time left. I want to first survey the audience for questions. Yes, sir.
So I work for Crown Castle, and we're deploying, thousands of cells. And one of the, I think, impediments or obstacles are the fees. So what is the correct fee? You guys are doing $2,000 a year. That's more than we would typically pay, like in California, where there was, you have a statewide franchise, we say, to access the right of way, and then so we're only going to pay a fee up to a point that makes sense before we would come into the pole placement. So at what point do the fees become, when the cities look at this as such a ubiquitous and necessary service, that the fees, they recover their costs, and then, that's about it. What's the right answer there in your mind?
I think we both probably share a little bit different perspective on this. I think there's a good rule of thumb formula for choosing your fee. If you look across the nation, $8,000 and attachment seems to be the high point, the high water mark, and the low water mark seems to be about $50 per location per year. Right, and I can understand why Crown Castle would like that. And it really goes to the question of the argument, should you run a city more like a business or not? Because any company can be in the right of way as long as they have the proper insurance and bonding and liability coverage. But that's not what's being asked here. The public purchased that light pole, and the public is due a return on that investment. Do you want to give things away, or do you want to get a market value for them? The rule of thumb that I've heard is you take a macro cell site attachment and you divide it by anywhere from 8 to 12, and that will give you a good small cell attachment rate for your community. Because the macro sites are based on your community, and they're well established, those rates.
I don't disagree with a lot of that. The fees have been wildly ranging from what we've seen. We've been involved in some studies of fees, and some of them seem very high, some of them seem very low. It comes down, in our experience, to some municipalities, their driving purpose is revenue. And so they're going to say, we want the most fee you can possibly get from these providers. And others say, no, we want to be more collaborative and encourage development, and we will negotiate that fee to something more reasonable. It also depends on, back to my attachment fee or attachment realm, right-of-way management. Is there an attachment fee at issue here in terms of attachments to city-owned structures in addition to a right-of-way fee that's going to happen? Because it seems that the providers it seems like a zero-sum game, essentially. They're looking at a cost per site and don't really care too much how those components come from. So if you have $1,000 on it as a right-of-way fee and then $2,000 for an attachment fee, the carrier looks at it and says $3,000. That may seem high. But there's different ways of looking at that too. Some states actually, and especially I believe the new legislation, limit costs in the right-of-way. So you may have some legislation that limits what you can recover in the right-of-way. That may not apply to your attachment fee to city-owned structures. So all of these factor in. I don't know what the right fee is.
Because it seems to me at some point, if the fees are too high, you're going to force providers to place their own poles. And you've got a proliferation more, you've got perfectly suitable existing verticality that would make a very nice concealed small cell.
Right.
It's not financially feasible.
Yeah.
So I don't know exactly what the right, somewhere between free and $5,000 or whatever, but that's something that we struggle with, where we come across a lot.
if Crown Castle would like to come to Lincoln, we will show you the value at $2,000 a year.
2-day turnaround.
2-day turnaround is very attractive, isn't it?
Very attractive.
Yes.
All right, we are in the waning minutes. Any other questions from the audience, or we can turn to parting shots from our panel? We've got, I think, time now for parting shots, final thoughts. We'll start with you, Courtney, and then move on down there.
Yeah, I think the key is that when somebody comes to you, whether it's the dark fiber provider or the wireless carrier, the opportunity to speak with them in the initial planning phase is key. It will protect your assets. It will protect the opportunity for you to assist in that deployment versus them coming to you and potentially presenting something that they're looking to force through. So collaboration in the beginning is key, and opening that line of communication and making sure that everybody's on the same page from the beginning helps significantly in the deployment.
I would say do your homework in terms of state and local law to see what applies and how it applies to the providers who come to you. Don't be afraid of the overall concept, and in fact, there's possibly a lot of opportunity with it.
Small cells are just one part of your overall broadband plan for your community. If you do not have fiber to the home and you want to get there, a lot of communities are negotiating dark fiber leases as part of the small cell deployment, and that can help you get towards that goal. So I would say that as a community, you should be looking at all three: fiber to the business, fiber to the home, and small cells.
At the risk of opening a can of worms as we as we adjourn, I would just urge you all to pay attention to the notice of proposed rulemaking that the FCC will adopt this Thursday, because it directly affects you, of course. And the Commission is reconsidering the time limits and the remedies that should apply to local review for small cells, co-location, new pole placements, et cetera. And they're essentially proposing to move from to a deemed granted remedy. So the shot clock expires, it's deemed granted. They're asking whether it should just be deemed granted, or instead they should just say, as a matter of authority, that the state and local governments have lost their authority at that point after the 90 days are up. They ask, should the 90 days be shortened to 60, for example, and they talk also about streamlining the environmental and historic preservation reviews, probably by exempting most of what we were talking about here from those reviews in the future. So if there's things that are below a certain height or, et cetera, that they may not be, covered by that anymore. So anyway, I'm oversimplifying, and Casey knows a lot more about this, but definitely worth your while to probably comment on this.
And it will inevitably be wrapped up in the courts for some time.
It's funny because that was the question that I didn't ask when I thought we had run out of time, and I'm glad you got to it during our parting shot. So there's definitely more to talk about with regard to that notice of proposed rulemaking that's coming up this week. And I'd encourage all of you guys to stay tuned at nextcenturycities.org and by following the organizations and companies represented here today. Thank you, everyone. And we've got a snack in the main hall. And please make sure you don't go anywhere. Our financing panel is coming up, so you can figure out how you're going to find the money to get all this done.